I'd like to welcome everybody to our 23rd Illegal Logging Stakeholder Update. Without further ado, we'll start on our first session, and we're going to be looking at the fLEGT approach overall, and beginning with a presentation from Bernard Crabbe of the European Commission. So Bernard, if I could invite you to come up. Thank you. And actually, just a quick note, we'll be taking the 3 presentations in turn and then having questions at the end. Bernard.
Do I stay here?
Yes, please.
Thank you. And good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you in this venerable house with some of the founding fathers and mothers of fLEGT. I think many among you have been involved for fLEGT for much longer than I have been. So I'm sorry I will be the first to speak today, but I'm here definitely more to listen to you and to learn from your experience. The topic of my presentation is to inform you and present you what we are planning in terms of the 10-year review of the implementation of the fLEGT action plan. But before starting, I should quickly introduce myself. I'm Bernard Crabbe, so I'm the new head of the forestry sector in DEVCO, in the Commission. As you know, the Commission has a leading role in the implementation of the fLEGT action plan. And this is, in fact, a co-lead between the DG Development Cooperation and the DG Environment, which is well represented today as well by Luca Perez. And so I have 2 other colleagues with us today. Thibaut Portevin, who is a historical person in the VPA process in Indonesia, and Daniel Jones from DEFRA, who is seconded to our team for 6 months. So, I don't know, but is there anybody in the room that doesn't know what fLEGT is? And it doesn't seem to be the case. So I had prepared some background information, but I will go very quickly through it. So the fLEGT action plan, as you know, was adopted in 2003. That means a bit more than 10 years ago. But that means also that its implementation, the very early stages of its implementation started 10 years ago. It's the EU response to illegal logging and the associated trade. The objectives are there. I think you can read them, you know them perfectly. It's a very innovative process. fLEGT goes well beyond projects, goes well beyond traditional development cooperation. It blends demand and supply side measures, and it works very much at the intersect between trade, governance, forestry, development cooperation. The action plan that is defined in a communication proposes a process and a package of measures that are structured in 7 areas of action. Again, I will not read them, but this is a reminder of what the fLEGT action plan structure is. We have come to the conclusion that 10 years after starting the implementation, it's very timely now to conduct a review of the implementation of the fLEGT action plan. Well, first of all, 10 years is a nice milestone to do such a review. Then, of course, we have had considerable investments of political, human, financial resources in the process. And not only by the Commission, member states have been very strongly engaged and have provided a lot of support. The actors in the room have been strongly involved in the implementation, civil society, private sector, and public administration. So that's very much a collective action. And it's probably very important to look at what collectively we have achieved. Then in 10 years, the world has changed quite significantly. A lot of the trends of today were already visible when the action plan was designed, but a lot of these trends have amplified since then. Not least, a major shift in the global timber trade. No need to expand on that. You know that the market share of the EU has decreased significantly, and that new trade centers have emerged. Deforestation drivers were already there, but they are more pressing than ever, probably. The red dynamic has brought a number of new elements. Forest is very much at the center of climate change discussions. Then there is this whole reflection on trying to define an international framework on sustainable development and the ambition to define sustainable development goals and a strong interest from many corners for the green economy. There has been no global review so far. There has been a very interesting progress report done by EFI, published in 2011, that looked back and tried to take stock of what had been achieved. There have been a lot of project and program evaluations, but beyond projects, no global review, as I said. We believe a lot of the lessons can be learned from the FLEGT process. We have said FLEGT is a very innovative process, and there is a strong feeling that a lot can be learned and possibly applied to other areas. And last but not least, 10 years after starting this, it's very important to keep and maintain and sustain the political momentum. And as you know, 2014 will be marked by European elections, meaning by the end of this year, we will have a new parliament and a new commission. No doubt that the FLEGT action plan has achieved a lot. I will not spend too much time on that, but you know that 6 voluntary partnership agreements have been concluded and are being actively implemented. 9 are under negotiation. A large number of initiatives have been financed, as I mentioned, in the progress report of 2011. There was an estimate of 600 million euros invested in these initiatives by the Commission and member states. A lot of forest governance changes have occurred in developing countries and law reforms. There have been very strong multi-stakeholder processes in the different countries we work with, greater transparency, major achievements in terms of participation of the civil society to a national dialogue on forestry issues. New capacities have been created, better information on what illegal logging is and its impacts. New legality assurance systems have been developed. The private sector has done a lot on its side, advancing on private sector certification schemes and codes of conduct. In terms of procurement policies, both the private sector and the public sector has done things and adopted procurement policies that try to pay attention to the issue of legal and sustainable timber. Not only in the north, also in the south. We have examples in Ghana, in Mexico, and in other places of new public procurement policies. There have been amendments to the transparency and accounting directives, trying to bring more transparency in forest-related investments. And finally, last but not least, last year, the EU timber regulation entered into application. All this has definitely led to a clear shift in market sentiment. Of course, we also have a number of questions that have arisen. Some of them will be discussed during these 2 days. There is still no FLEGT licensed timber on the market. Countries are struggling to some extent to put the systems in place. And in some countries, there are some signs of fatigue a bit on this process. It's a resource-intensive process. So the question also is how much is it replicable to other areas? Some issues, and will be discussed these 2 days, are considered not sufficiently addressed in the VPAs. There are concerns of possible unintended effects, for example, on small producers. Then there are questions on whether the implementation has put adequate attention to the different areas of the FLEGT action plan. Then what I have mentioned, the international and in particular the EU market are a small and decreasing portion of overall timber trade. So in order to document achievements and in order to try to address some of these questions, we are proposing a review process that would focus on the 4 objectives you have on the screen. The first one is very much try to assess what we have collectively achieved, what we have done well, what we haven't done well, what are the limitations of what we have done, what challenges we have met. That's also an accountability exercise. After investing so much in a policy, it's important to be able to say what we have achieved with this public and private money. The second aspect is try to identify the changes in the global context and how they may affect the relevance and to some extent the effectiveness of the FLEGT action plan. The third one is to draw lessons from our experience in order to inform the future implementation, but also possibly to be able to transpose these lessons to other areas. And the last but not least, the last one is to guide our future efforts on forest law enforcement, governance, and trade. The scope of the review would be the review would cover the 10 first years of implementation. The review would aim at covering all actions, the collective actions, both financed by the EU, by member states, but also by partner countries, including state and non-state actors. Of course, the focus would not be at project level, but would be to the collective result of this action at policy level. The review would cover the 7 areas of the FLEGT action plan that we have seen on the second slide, and also their interrelationships. The review would cover action both in producer countries and in the EU and other consumer markets, because that's an important feature of the action plan, to work both on the supply and the demand side. And finally, there is a mandatory EUTR review, so a review of the EU timber regulation that is due to take place in 2015. So both processes will be closely coordinated and will be presented as a package. The approach is, so just a word on where we stand in preparing this review. We started very much at the FLEGT coordination meeting last year in October, where there was a breakout group working on this and having an initial brainstorming on what the review could and should look like. So that was an initial consultation with stakeholders. Then we had a lot of internal work in the Commission. We then had initial discussions with the member states. And what I am presenting today is very much the result of this process. We will be very happy to listen to your suggestions today as well. And this will lead us then to draft terms of reference for a review. A big part of the review will be carried out by an external team of experts that we will contract and that we expect to start working during the last quarter of 2014 in order to get the best people. And it will not be easy to find people up to the task. In order to get the best people, we will have to go through quite an extensive tendering process. We are afraid. We are always happy to shorten these things, but in this case, I think we have to pay a lot of attention to this recruitment process. The main elements of the review, well, there will be a lot of preparatory work before this team starts. And we are starting already with the support of the European Forest Institute to document what we have achieved, a bit more systematically than in the past, maybe, to document what we have achieved in each country. Of course, we are a bit judge and parties, so we try to put the facts on paper, and these facts will be then analyzed by the external review team. The review, we expect the team to spend a lot of time in a desk review of all the published materials on fLEGT. fLEGT has generated an enormous amount of studies and evaluations, assessments. One of the big tasks of the review team will be to go through this documentation. And one of the difficult tasks will be to try to identify among all this literature what are the key documents. An important part of the documents will be the evaluation of large programs under the fLEGT action plan, including the UK-funded FGMC. There will be, as fLEGT is a multi-stakeholder process, a collective action, there will be broad stakeholder consultations throughout the process. One of the tools to do that, that we will try to put in place is a web-based consultation mechanism that will allow stakeholders to communicate with the expert team and provide opinions, judgments, evidence, analysis that can feed into the review process. There will be an inventory of interventions under the fLEGT action plan. There will be very much like in the progress report of 2010, surveys of member states. Well, in 2010, there was an extensive survey of member states to assess what they have done and how they perceive the implementation of the fLEGT action plan. We will extend that to partner countries and to other stakeholders. And finally, we will need to go to the field, of course, to some of the partner countries, to a sample, and have country case studies. The output of the process, we don't have a predefined agenda there. We are very much willing to have this objective assessment, and we are hoping to make a strong case for the new Commission and the new decision makers to renew commitments in the implementation of the fLEGT action plan, and possibly to adjust our efforts in order to better address what we try to address. I will not spend too much time on that. In terms of criteria for the evaluation, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. That's a bit traditional, and you have seen these criteria for long, but these are internationally agreed evaluation criteria. This is very much the reference in the work of the Commission as well. So we will assess the relevance, the effectiveness, the efficiency, the impact of the fLEGT action plan, with also attention to the complementary dimensions that are there: sustainability, innovativeness and replicability, policy coherence, how coherent is the fLEGT action plan with other policy we have, and finally assessing whether there is an added value of EU level action on this area. So that's a bit where we are in this preparatory process for the review. I would like, well, as I said, we are very much willing to listen to your suggestions and your views on this process. We would further encourage you to do your analysis at your level, and it would be very, very interesting to have a group of stakeholders making their own assessment, which would then be available to the review team to assess it. So I would encourage you to contribute to the process. There will be mechanisms in place to allow for your inputs to feed into the process. And I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Bina. Yes, we'll move on now to the next presentation and then take questions at the end. So Yeah, thank you, Bernard. If you sit down at the front, maybe. Yeah. So if I could invite Indra van Gisbergen to the platform, who'll be giving a NGO perspective on the fLEGT review. Go ahead. It should pop up.
Yeah. Do I have to push?
They're finding it, I think. There we go.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank, first of all, the Chatham House for inviting us to give this presentation and to share with you also our views on the review of the fLEGT action plan. So as many of you know, FERN has been involved many years with fLEGT and the whole action plan, and this at the very, very early hours. So more than 30 years ago, a lot of NGOs were campaigning against illegal logging, and they managed, in fact, to raise a lot of public awareness. But it was well understood that this was not enough, and that a political decision and a political action was needed. And therefore, in 2002, FERN, together with Chatham House, in fact, made a kind of blueprint of the fLEGT action plan. It was discussed, and it was called, at the time, Controlling Imports of Illegal Timber Options for Europe. And this, in the end, in 2003, led to the fLEGT action plan, and which turned out to be a great success. Now, since the adoption of the action plan, we've been heavily involved in further developing the plan, but also implementing the plan together, of course, with our partners in the field and the timber-producing countries. Now, as Bernard pointed out, the world has changed in the meantime. And in fact, today, a lot of campaigners and NGOs are very, very concerned about the destruction of the forest, not only by illegal logging, but also by agriculture and the commercialization of agriculture and the rush for land. So this has a changed environment, and we have to deal with. And so it's a great opportunity we have now to put all these concerns on the table when we're discussing the review today. So I'm very, very looking forward to the 2 days meeting and have the chance with you to discuss about these new challenges, which are really very heavy concerns, not only for the people here in the room, but also for all the people we work with daily and with whom we are in touch with on a daily basis. So 2014, 2015 is our key years. And I think it's great that we've been invited to give an insight in our perspective on this review. I just destroyed it. I don't know. Okay. So since we were involved in the very beginning, we were quite enthusiastic about this action plan. And what we've seen is, in fact, this action plan has been really effective, and we may say that it's a great success, because the action plan, in fact, contributed tremendously to the decrease of illegal logging, and this because we went to the heart of the problem, and namely the action plan addresses the root causes of the illegal logging problem. So very sensitive things, such as corruption and mismanagement, were dealt with, and also the underlying problem of the lack of clarification of tenure rights is an issue that has been discussed during the negotiations and also during the implementation of the fLEGT action plan. It's very clear that the action plan has set an agenda for improving forest governance, and so addresses very difficult issues. It has been a revolutionary process in the sense that we'd never seen a process where there was full participation of different stakeholders from, on the one hand, the industry, governments, and civil society. In a lot of timber-producing countries, civil society is extremely weak, is hardly existing, and is not very familiar in occupying a seat at the table and contributing to the decision-making. So that is, for us, or in our perspective, and thinking many NGOs share this perception, is really a success of the VPA. And then, as I said before, it has an effect not only on the forest sector, but it goes far beyond it. Now, without going into repetition, very quickly, some achievements we see. Well, as you know, the FLEGT Action Plan provides demand and supply measures, and on both ends, we see great and concrete achievements. First of all, the public procurement. There are some member states who adapted their procurement policies and include not only environmental criteria, but also social criteria in their public procurement policies. And that is a great step forward. And now, since January, we also have new EU Public Procurement Directive, which is also a very positive step forward. And a victory, I think, for not only the organizations working on forests, but also organizations working on fair trade, and so on. Then there is, of course, the EU timber regulation, which came into force last year in March. And even if the implementation of the EUTR is still a great challenge, it is a very, very important tool to combat illegal logging. But then the big winner of this whole action plan, I think, from our perspective, is the VPAs, the voluntary partnership agreements, legally binding trade agreements, which go far beyond the trade about timber. It was said before, 6 have been concluded, and the negotiation of 9 different VPAs is underway. The VPA provides, in fact, almost in all of them, transparency annexes, and that is really key to combat corruption and mismanagement. So what, in fact, are the keys for the success? I think the number one key to the success is the process in itself. That is part of the secret. It is the backbone, the fact that people can participate and are part of the decision-making process is really, really key, which is very different from other processes where there is a more top-down mechanism and where people are not really, do not have the possibility in setting the agenda and putting the real issues on the table. The fact that it's also focused on a very specific commodity and focused on the forest sector is a strength. Some people may say it's maybe a weakness that it does not address everything, but maybe that's also a strength. And via this discussion about a very clear trade of a particular commodity, then we can have a discussion about transparency and all that. And the advantage is focusing on this commodity is that this led also to tangible results, and it's not so vague. The discussions are very concrete. Also, the focus on legality is something quite strong, because that means that you have to have the rules and regulations in place which can provoke change. And that is, of course, very interesting to have long-lasting and sustainable results. The fact that there is this openness and flexibility within the discussions around the VPA to adapt the VPA according to the needs and the context, that is really key. So the problems related to every country and different communities and so on in different countries, that is really very, very important. Also, the fact that this process went together with investment in capacity building for NGOs or civil society players, but also industry and also government, is very important in timber-producing countries, which often are very poor countries with very low capacities. Now, of course, there are limitations of this plan. And today, we do not have any FLEGT license yet. It's very unsure when the first FLEGT license will be issued. So it's great that we have a review, but already we hope that the review will not stop us in continuing and going until the finish. We have to recognize that if we talk about reforms and all that, and a process where you have dialogue with so many partners, that is a slow process. I think we could have known that from the beginning. And even people say it's already 10 years I think for so big things, maybe it is a relative because it is also a very unique process. Now, what we also have observed is that in the whole plan, there was in fact provided that also the financial sector has a role to control illegal logging. Now, this aspect of the fLEGT action plan is something that has been set apart a little bit, despite the fact that it was very, very clearly and explicitly foreseen in the plan. So the roles of the banks and the financial institutions to combat illegal logging is something that has been so far been neglected. And so also the EU money laundering directive maybe has not done enough to tackle the problem. Now, we've spoken about the changed environment, so this plan does not really address the current problems. And we all know that land grabbing in a lot of VPA countries is escalating, specifically in Africa. So if we look at the VPA countries where there is really big concerns, we can name Gabon, Cameroon, Congo-Brazzaville, DRC. In all these countries, there's a speculation for land, a rush for land, and investors want to set up also large-scale palm oil plantations and so on. So that is really a big concern. Moreover, there is a worrying forecast that 70 to 80% of the deforestation in the tropics may come from commercial agriculture. And here below is a picture of the Heracles Farms case. Probably some of you have heard about this. It's a US-based company who is responsible for land grabbing and wants to have a huge palm oil plantation. And so it has generated a lot of discussion and put, I think, the issue of conversion timber really on our radar. So we've been asked or invited to say a word about the priorities we see for this review. First of all, it's important, I think, there are clear definitions of the review objectives. And I'm delighted, in fact, to see that the Commission doesn't want to rush it and really think it over and maybe shifts it a little bit towards the end of the year, so that it's very clear what the framework would be. So if we have very clear objectives, then it will become clear what the outcomes would be. But as I said before, the fLEGT action plan is not done yet. There's so many things that still needs to do. So we hope that this exercise is just a kind of springboard to do better in the future. And so according to us, the following priorities at least should in one way or another be addressed. Now, the implementation of the concluded VPAs is really key. We really have to go till the end because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to export the successes of the VPA maybe, or will not be so interesting to convince other people to copy this process. So keeping the momentum is a challenge, and also counter the VPA fatigue, and continue to invest in capacity building is key. While we're implementing the VPAs, there has to be a dialogue about this conversion timber. It's not possible, I think, at this point, that just to ignore it, and we're very, very happy that it's taken up by the EU Commission very seriously, and probably in the course of this year, we will continue these discussions. But a lot of VPAs are not yet concluded. So there, it is a chance to integrate in the discussions, ongoing discussions, also these new realities. Let's think about, for example, the VPA negotiations in DRC. It's clear that the issue of conversion timber should be discussed while negotiating the VPA there. Then there is, of course, the rigorous implementation of the EUTR that is needed. If not, it can undermine, in fact, the VPAs and destroy all the work that has been done. So that is something that really needs to be addressed as well. Then I think it's important also that during the review, people are looking towards the commitment of the EU in halting global deforestation, cutting tropical deforestation by 50% very, very soon. I mean, already the cut of 50% should be done in 2020. So that's only 6 years away from here. So how is the EU going to do this? And so in addressing, for example, the issue of conversion timber, right now, I think that can contribute to get this target. So on the one hand, there is a challenge in combining all these issues with the follow-up of the EU footprint study, but also in negotiating or discussing the big problem of conversion with the counterpart in the timber-producing countries. Moreover, as said before, the financial due diligence chapter in the plan has been neglected a little bit. It would be interesting during the review to understand very well why this is, because it is important to understand why these very important actors such as banks and financial institutions, their role has not been really fully addressed the last 10 years. Why is this? Of course, as I said before, capitalizing the best practices of the VPA process or the FLEGT action plan is really key. And why? Maybe to do better in the future, in the next phase of the plan itself, but also to export lessons learned to maybe other EU action plans in the future. And Duncan Brecht this afternoon will speak more about this. But we really think that also an EU action plan that addresses agricultural deforestation may be a viable option. And therefore, it's very, very important to get a good understanding about the lessons learned. But even if the VPA, the FLEGT action plan will not be expanded to other commodities because that is maybe too far and stretching it too out, and the danger would be that we would dilute the action plan, then already today it's very important to reach out to other DGs and the EEIS to make sure that the lessons learned are transferred to somewhere else. So these discussions with other partners within the Commission should already start, we believe, during the review process itself. Or this is an opportunity. And then, of course, we really think that the process of the review is very key. Since participation is the backbone of the FLEGT process itself, it's also important that within the review, stakeholders are involved. But Bernard pointed it out, that this is the direction we are going, and that the review is meant to be participatory, and that a lot of people who were involved here and also on the other end, that is the purpose. So that is very, very positive. So far, some of the ideas. Many, many thanks, and we really hope that this review will be a great success. Thank you.
Thank you, Indra, for those ideas. We'll move on to our third presenter. So I'd like to invite Sue Unsworth, who's going to give her perspective on some of the lessons that have been learned from fLEGT. Should come up. Okay.
Good. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. For those of you who don't know me, perhaps I should explain that I worked for DFID for a very long time, and that, excuse me, in 2003, 2004, I was their chief governance advisor, and I got involved in thinking about what people now call the political economy of development. In those days, we called it drivers of change. And that was how I got interested in fLEGT and the fLEGT process. And what I'm going to argue today is that it seems to me important that any review should capture process as well as impact. And by that I mean both the processes through which fLEGT is successful, because I think that that is important in informing the way fLEGT goes forward in future, but also the processes through which the action plan and all that followed from it were conceived and designed and implemented, because that, I think, has some broader interest for the development community. And I'm going to talk a little bit about trends in the development business, and particularly the growing interest in thinking and working politically. I'm going to just say a bit about how fLEGT looks if you view it through a political economy lens. I'm going to talk a bit about those processes that were behind the making of fLEGT, and then I'm going to suggest one or two implications for policymakers that people might want to bear in mind in designing the review process. Okay, I haven't worked out how this, that's it. Thinking and working politically. I don't know how many of you have come across a book that was published last year by Tom Carruthers that's called Development Aid Confronts Politics, the Almost Revolution. But if you're looking for some kind of an overview of what people mean when they say that thinking and working politically, that's a very good starting point. And this is a debate that I think there is some growing momentum to, that there is perhaps the beginnings of a critical mass of people in the development business who are saying that those old-style technocratic apolitical processes of aid giving, where you transfer money and skills and institutions and policies, really don't work. And they don't work because they don't recognize that development is an inherently political process. And by that I mean that it involves conflict and cooperation and negotiation between different interest groups in pursuit of resources and influence. And that the way in which you make some progressive change is when people come together, identify common interests, identify ways forward. If those arrangements work and become institutionalized, you get the basis of institution making. So when you're talking about development as an inherently political process, that's what I'm meaning, those processes of interaction, of conflict, of cooperation, of negotiation, of bargaining between interest groups. And what this conversation that's going on among development practitioners is saying is that donors really need to understand both the context and the political economy dynamics at work in those contexts if they're going to find any way of intervening effectively, and that this means some really quite radical changes to current donor practice. Long-term, iterative, flexible approaches to respond to uncertainty, seize opportunities, support local problem solving. And it seems to me that this is exactly the way in which the fLEGT action plan has worked, and why it's interesting and why it provides some insights to this wider debate. I should say that, and this is the point in the way of the Carruthers title, The Almost Revolution, that although there is a lot of talk at the moment about thinking and working politically, it is not informing mainstream donor practice. And in a way, that's why it seems to me that if you've got good examples like fLEGT, whereby you can say to the main donor agencies, look, actually, not only is this possible in theory, it's possible in practice, it's been done. That's quite an important contribution to the debate. Okay. I wanted to say a little bit about viewing fLEGT through a political economy lens. And this is a slightly different take from other presentations we've heard this morning about why fLEGT works, all of which is valid. But it seems to me that if you look at it from a political economy perspective, what's interesting is that fLEGT, the action plan and all that's followed from it, really does engage with incentives of key stakeholders. And those incentives are material incentives, but they're reputational incentives as well. They're political incentives. I first got interested in fLEGT because I was sharing a taxi ride with Julia Faulkner in Accra in early 2006. And she said to me, you know, this new regulation that's just gone through the Commission, it has made the timber merchants and the timber business sit up and take notice in Ghana like nothing we've done before. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. It's interesting because it's engaging with incentives, material, reputational, political incentives. It worked, I think, because fLEGT recognized early on at the Bali meeting and subsequently that illegal logging is a shared problem. It builds on common interests, or the fLEGT action plan builds on common interests between government, business, civil society, stakeholders in producer and consumer countries. And finding common interests and ways of taking them forward seems to me to be the heart of the development process. It works because it respects sovereignty and local ownership through a voluntary process, through local definitions of legality. It works because it uses EU market leverage, but it uses EU market leverage to support local processes of change. And that is the absolutely critical bit, as the previous speaker said, of the fLEGT process. It facilitates flexible responses to local context and diversity. So it allows you to operate differently in a context where the history and the structures and the institutions and the political incentives are different. And it made very strategic use of aid because the heart of the relationships in fLEGT are around trade and they're around political relationships. It's not essentially an aid relationship, but aid has played a very strategic part. And it seems to me that as the mainstream donor agencies become frankly less important and aid becomes a much more marginal contribution to development, this is something that aid agencies really need to think about. They need to think about how to make strategic use of aid. I think they become very lazy because an aid relationship is a kind of a conventional one. It's one that gives a donor some power and some access. But actually, increasingly, donors are going to need to think about how to operate with aid relationships that are much more strategic. I did a bit of work this summer talking to a lot of people who've been involved in fLEGT to capture the process involved in conceiving, designing, implementing this process from the mid-1990s onwards. And I think that this is I find it a fascinating and really in many ways a very remarkable story. And I think it does have a lot to say to donor agencies working in different sectors. And these are just some of the key ingredients of that process. It was a very long-term engagement, and it built on past learning. If you look at the fLEGT action plan, the roots of that go back a very long way. They go back to those sustainability initiatives post-Rio in the 1990s. They go back to the work that EIA and Global Witness did, investigative work in Indonesia. They go back to the experience of donors, the EU, DFID and others, in trying to introduce improved forest governance in that very conventional top-down way. They go back to, and the fLEGT plan builds on experience of the UK Timber Trade Federation in Indonesia. So if you look at some of the sort of genesis, if you like, of the fLEGT action plan, it does go back a long way. And I think bearing in mind that any major processes of change do involve that long-term engagement, and building on past learning is important. The people involved in fLEGT had an intuitive understanding of political economy context. These days, donors have rather elaborate frameworks, some of which I've helped to design, which take them through and ask a lot of questions about, the political economy context of a country or a sector. And that's useful. It's necessary to do it if you haven't otherwise done it. But the people involved in fLEGT did this intuitively, because a lot of them had spent time working in the forestry sectors in remote parts of Indonesia and Cambodia and Cameroon. And they had political economy, if you like, in the blood. They just understood that that was what the forest sector is about. It's about that constant bargaining between different interests, political interests, economic interests. Another aspect of the policy making behind the fLEGT action plan that I think is important is that it was very iterative policy making. People were developing a menu of options. The fLEGT action plan itself is a process. They didn't close off options. They didn't have predefined options at too early a stage. And if you're looking ahead for how to take this forward, I think that's something that's really worth bearing in mind. There was a vast amount of opportunism about the fLEGT process. Back in sort of 1998 with the G8 meeting and that G8 action plan, the Bali meeting in 2001, the China-EU summit in 2005, and constant, very remarkable for an aid agency, flexible funding, flexibility to respond to opportunities as they came up, small and big. The next point, I think, is possibly the most important. I mean, there was, over a period of, say, 1998, or more particularly perhaps 2002 onwards, by the people involved in designing the fLEGT process, a huge investment in knowledge, in building knowledge through research, investigative reporting, in understanding the nature of the illegal logging problem, what underpinned it. Huge investment in building relationships and alliances and supporting fora like Chatham House that brought together the key stakeholders that debated the issues. And that seems to me, I mean, the really indispensable bit, if you like, of the making of the fLEGT action plan. Room to experiment and learn. The people I talked to this summer, quite a lot of them said to me, we didn't really know what we were doing. We just knew we had to do something, and we got on with it, and we saw how it would pan out, which is fine if you're also supporting that with an ongoing learning process. And again, I think the Chatham House meetings were a really important part of that sort of social learning that was inherent in fLEGT. And then something that I've called purposive muddling, which I think is very well illustrated in the way some of those early VPA processes were designed. And it's purposive muddling because the people who were involved in, say, the design of the very first VPA in Ghana, they knew the context, they had some very clear objectives, and they had some red lines in terms of being clear that there were some principles that had to be observed. But there was muddling, there was experimentation, there was flexibility in terms of working with a group of stakeholders and finding ways to support a local process and particularly multi-stakeholder processes that brought key stakeholders together and that this was a multi-stakeholder process with teeth. And it emerged from what I have called a process of purposive muddling, and I think that's also something. that's an important ingredient in designing and conceiving really big development initiatives of the kind that fLEGT is. So, my final slide. It seems to me that it is really important to keep open the space to think and work politically like this. And it's important for the future of fLEGT, and it's important more generally in the development business. And so what do aid agencies need to do? Well, they need to hire good people. They need to trust them. A lot of the people who were involved in DFID, in the Commission, in the Dutch government, were trusted insiders, given quite a bit of flexibility. And then you need to keep them, because the other aspect that struck me about fLEGT and the making of fLEGT was the extraordinary continuity of people right the way through from the 1998 onwards. They need to value country and sector knowledge to an extent that I think isn't happening these days in mainstream agencies. They need to avoid pressures to spend and predefine options. The people working on the fLEGT action plan all told me that although there was a lot of political interest, they were not under what they saw as unrealistic pressure, either to spend money or to make progress according to a predefined timetable. Long-term engagement, not short-term results, flexible practice, funding and risk-taking. And you might think that this was common sense. This is obvious. It is, however, not the way that mainstream donor agencies are currently working. And if I think about what would have killed fLEGT early on, it would have been calling John Hudson in and telling him he had to write a business plan, he had to develop 4 options and assess them for value for money, he had to show short-term results, and he had to spend £300 million within 3 years. Okay, point made. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. If you could stay at the front, please, and if I could invite the other 2 speakers back, then we'll take some questions. So some, yes, very thought-provoking presentations, in particular from Sue there, so I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions. I'll take a few at a time and then see how we get on. Oh.
Am I in the right place?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And when you ask your question, if you could introduce yourself as well, please. So first, from the gentleman over there. And then microwave.
Question for Bernard, or a comment really. I think in the review it's absolutely critical to include design as part of the evaluation, not just relevance. And by that I mean clarity of purpose, clarity of behavioural results within any intervention, and particularly indicators, practical, simple indicators for governance reform.
Any more questions? Yes, so these 2 hands in the middle. First, Rachel.
Hi, Rachel Butler, Independent. I'd just like to ask whether there was a private sector update or perspective that should have been given this morning. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. A good point. Yes, the gentleman here.
Good morning. Ewan Grant, Independent Tax and Customs Consultant, the former analyst in Customs and Excise for transnational organised crime. My question is for all members, and probably particularly specifically in relation to Sue Unsworth's comments. The point about the technical donor aid approach not always working, I thought was exceptionally well made, and certainly was implied also by the other speakers. Are there any plans, particularly perhaps at EU level, to more closely involve in a cooperation dialogue other major donor organizations? The reason I say that, particularly in relation to World Bank programs, a few months ago, I heard a lady from the World Bank speak by audio Skype from Washington to a conference on taking the dirty money out of politics at the Overseas Development Institute. And she greatly surprised the audience, but also, and greatly impressed them, by openly admitting that the World Bank hadn't been at its best in dealing with non-technical assistance issues or taking them into account. But there was, this is December, a few weeks before Christmas, an imminent policy plan change supported by the very top of the World Bank, and it was a genuine one that they had to change. I injected a slight note of skepticism by saying we need to be careful that something imposed has problems in a way from something which everybody genuinely believes in. And the lady did not in any way take an exception to that. She thought that was a fair point. So are there plans to actively involve a wide range of other international governance organizations, maybe UNDC in relation to their ongoing work in West Africa might be another one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will take one more question and then some responses. So just behind you.
Yeah, good morning. Agha Schulmeister, WWF. I would actually have a question concerning the plan review and for the next phase, because I find it quite interesting, and I think there were very good points made this morning about what has been achieved and what might be lacking. But I think where everybody was a bit hopping around and not coming to the point was about an analysis why the implementation at the moment is not working. And I don't think that it's not only about the fact that, you know, there are problems. No, it's lacking an analysis what are the problems and why do we get the goal that the VPAs had, which I see in two tiers. The first one about engaging civil society has worked. The second, getting legal timber to the EU, hasn't, nowhere. And I think that's a very important point as well for the next phase to look into before we look into other new challenges, which are certainly there, to, you know, figure out what we need to do to get this running. Because I think some of the reasons for the fatigue is the fact that this is not working. And I guess, you know, we need to keep that into mind.
Okay, thank you. If I just respond to Rachel's comment, I take responsibility for not having a private sector represented up here, which, on reflection, would have been valuable, I think. But Bernard, your responses.
Good, thank you. Thank you for these inspiring questions. And thanks to the other two presenters, I have to say that, well, first, FERN has been very proactive in terms of trying to document what we achieve. Probably you have taken a lead there, and so we hope you will continue in the year to come to do that, to feed into this important process. And then thanks to Sue for bringing this very important political economy perspective to this process. And as I said, we are here to learn. I think on this side, we all have to learn. I fully agree that we have to look back at the design, to the design of the FLEGT action plan. We assume it's part of this analysis of relevance of the FLEGT action plan. So look back at the design and indeed look back at how the process was conceived. You have said, so FLEGT is a process and propose a number of areas of action. We have to look back at how the process was conceived, what changes were intended through this process, and what were the assumptions behind the design. And so we have probably to look back at these assumptions. with today's perspective and look whether these assumptions were right or whether we have to possibly adjust or modify these assumptions and adjust the process accordingly. Regarding plans to engage more actively with other donors, well, that's part of what we try to do. One of the challenges of fLEGT is that we have to engage with everybody, partner governments, civil society, private sector, other organizations. So it's quite a range of other DGs in the Commission, colleagues, and so on. So that's a complex task. We have identified indeed the need to work more with the big other international organizations. We tried to do it in each VPA process. So systematically, when we have important milestones, we extend the organization to these agencies, and we try to bring them, not necessarily in formal sessions, but at least in the preparatory meetings. But that's definitely an important process. We need to work more with them. We need also to strengthen the link with other processes. I should mention the RED process. You are probably aware that we are funding a facility within the European Forest Institute, which is working on the fLEGT RED intersect, and we believe that's something we need to do more. On the last comment, looking at why implementation is not working, I think, well, that's part of the review is to look at where we haven't succeeded, to look at the limitations of our action. I wouldn't take as a starting point the judgment that implementation is not working. I think yeah, that's an important dimension. I think that's, well, first of all, an important side of the exercise is to document what we have achieved as a whole. It's true that the VPAs are about putting in place a licensing scheme. That's probably the instrument that the VPAs put in place. The finality is to improve forest law enforcement and governance. So indeed, the fLEGT licensing schemes, none of them are fully operational, but 2 countries in this room, represented in this room, have made substantial progress to it. But on the side of developing their systems, we believe they've made a lot of progress in terms of building awareness of on illegality, building awareness of what is the legal framework, bringing clarity in the legal definitions, building capacities, putting these issues high on the political agenda. That's whole aspects of what Sue, I think, mentioned earlier. We have not been good at documenting all these achievements. So part of the process is to document these achievements. Now, coming back to the fLEGT licensing, of course, it's one of our obsessions in the Commission, and we are reminded every week that we have to deliver on that. And we are working hard, but we are working hard. The task is mainly with our partner country. We do as much as we can to support them. But we have to realize that what they are putting in place is quite ambitious. It's quite ambitious and complex. And we also, last comment, I have been a bit long in my response, but we also need to look back at the time horizon. VPAs basically started in 2005 to 2006. So we are talking about 6-7 years maximum since the first discussions. That's a very short time horizon for the process of change we are talking about. So it's no surprise that having operational system takes time, and we prefer to have credible system in place rather than quickly have weak systems. So that's part of the reasons. But we will look at that during the review.
Okay, thanks, Bernard. Indra, do you have any points to add?
Yes, I would like to come back on the last point about the frustration. There is no legal timber yet on the EU market, and why the implementation is facing a problem, having a problem. I would fully agree that the implementation is tremendously complex and ambitious, and I think that if you talk, for example, about legal reform in a country, that's a huge task. And I think that maybe it has been underestimated, the fact that it requires really time. And in a lot of these countries where reforms are really very important in the whole process, it's very important that these reforms happen in a very participatory way. But of course, we are not, if, for example, in Cameroon and in Congo, where there are reforms ongoing, it's not only the VPA that is driving these reforms. So there are many other issues that come up, and civil society has to think about them. For example, in Cameroon, it's under pressure of legalizing the conversion, for example, of forests to agriculture, that the reform is pushed forward. So it's not only the VPA driving this reform, and civil society and other actors have to be prepared. So that explains why things are dragging on. And I think it's a challenge in finding the balance between progressing and not pushing and pressurizing the partner countries and all the stakeholders, and finding the right balance. And so to not get frustrated and to counter this VPA fatigue, which is very likely to happen, maybe it would be interesting to work with certain realistic milestones where we can hang on and get a better understanding or assess better the progress that can be made, just to help us not to be frustrated all the time. So I think that is really very important. About donor coordination, yes, I think that is something that the EU is doing already, but would be for the next years also be a challenge, I think. On RED, for example, which is happening in a lot of VPA countries, the coordination with World Bank representatives, for example, in the countries is not always really very easy to be done. So, yeah, the question is how you can tackle that, and maybe member states could also play a more active role in supporting this coordination efforts.
Okay, thank you. Sue, would you like to respond?
I was struck by the first speaker's wish to see practical, simple indicators for governance reform. I mean, obviously there are some indicators in terms of legal changes and changes in procedures. But it seems to me that what one's also trying to capture is changes in relationships and informal institutions and processes. And maybe rather than talking to the World Bank as an institution or other donors as sort of institutional manifestations, I think it would be worth having a conversation with people within donor agencies who are struggling with this issue about how you make an assessment of qualitative change and process over time. And this is an issue that comes up wherever donors are making an effort to think and work politically. And there are some interesting ideas out there. So I think that there is a link to be made, but I don't think it's an institutional link with the World Bank. I think it's a link with a group of people within the bank or within DFID or other agencies who actually do have some interesting ideas emerging in other sectors about how to monitor more qualitative change.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions. I'll take a cluster on this side. So if we start down at the beginning.
Thank you. Hannah Mowat from FERN. the word review implies backward looking, which I think is very important, and we've been doing a lot of talking about the need to look at what has worked and what hasn't worked and why. But I would also be interested in hearing the word perspective, a FLEGT perspective. To what extent is this review also forward-looking? We're looking at a very different world today, very different perspectives. It was illegal logging was the big driver, is today the big driver illegal conversion of timber through agriculture. So to what extent is the review also forward-looking, and how can we make use of that?
Thank you. And Duncan.
Thanks very much. Duncan Brack, independent researcher, also an associate here at Chatham House. I'd like to ask Rachel, what is the private sector perspective on fLEGT? So perhaps we can give her a few minutes to think about that and then give her the microphone.
Okay, and Sham as well.
Thank you, Alison. Sham Satpur-Granzella, Malaysian Timber Council. Quick question for Bernard, I'm afraid. I think that's another important element that's missing from this morning's panel in terms of having a BPA partner also giving their perspectives, or perhaps having a BPA negotiating partner to add value to what all of you have discussed. And it's quite clear as to where the frustrations lie. I see that very clearly working with both sides. But there are people in the room who are represented from countries that have concluded the VPA, and there are also representatives in the room who are still negotiating on the VPA. And perhaps if we listen to why the conclusion has not been followed through with full implementation, we could have a full-day workshop on this. But I think it would really help address both the review as well as the perspective for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And there's some questions at the back there. I'll go there first.
Hello, Valerie DeLeader-Kirk from WWF. I just had a quick question for Bernard regarding the plans to coordinate, if I understood correctly, the two reviews, the fLEGT and the EUTR. Just was wondering the thinking behind that, as they're both quite big and expansive.
Okay. And then just behind you, I'll take one more question in this round.
Thank you very much. Saminkiti Atropemos from Ghana. Actually two observations, and one has already been articulated. I think it would have been interesting to at least have a member country or partner country on the panel, if not as a key speaker. My other comment is about the assumption that the VPA has, or the fLEGT has not delivered. If you look at the acronym fLEGT, T is only the last letter, is the ultimate goal. I can understand the frustration on the European side, as somebody said. But I think it has achieved a lot, especially if you compare fLEGT process with the RED process in countries that are implementing the two. You find that many people will usually give a bigger tick for fLEGT because of the process and because of the time that has been allowed. If you put time limits, as articulated by one of the speakers, you realize that you can get a product, but it may not be the type of product you want. After all, we don't seem to have fLEGT licensed timber as a major delivery in the whole setup. The whole focus, as I understand, is to address illegal logging. So if we are able to develop and put in place structures that address illegal logging, the ultimate product of fLEGT licensed timber becomes a minor. Of course, to the European, it's a major issue. But I think for partner countries in particular, the process is very important, and structures and systems that are being put in place are very paramount. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think mostly comments and questions for Bernard, and then I'll ask Rachel if she wants to say anything.
Good. The importance of this review to be forward-looking, yes, we fully agree. And we will try to design it that way. At the same time, as I said, there is an important element of accountability and clearly documenting what we have achieved. But the main purpose is definitely to renew momentum, is to inform future decision-making, to learn lessons, both for future implementation of fLEGT and for other processes and other development cooperation area, policy area. And it's to guide the future of EU's efforts to address illegal logging, including the possibility of broadening the approach and trying to better address the other drivers. I think the risk there has been highlighted by Indra, the risk of diluting our action and losing effectiveness if we try to address too much is there, but that's definitely something we need to consider. On the need for listening carefully at the perspective of VPA partner countries, I can only but agree, having spent most of my professional life in developing countries. That's definitely something that is key. The progress report of 2010 had a quite comprehensive survey of member states' views. As I have said, a new dimension of this review will be a comprehensive survey of partner countries' views. And then the idea is as well to select a sample of partner countries, a representative sample of partner countries, and to have in-depth field assessments at the level of these countries to learn from their story. What was the situation at the beginning? What has been the process? What the process has achieved? What are the perceptions of the different stakeholders in these countries? So that's definitely something we will pay attention to. On the coordination of the UTR review and the fLEGT action plan review, well, first, for your information, one is mandatory. The UTR review is mandatory. The regulation foresees a review of implementation of the regulation after 4 years, probably, or 5 years. 5 years. EUTR being a key, the fLEGT action plan review is not a mandatory one. But EUTR being a key element of the fLEGT action plan, it's obvious that we need to coordinate both processes. They will have their specificity, so we can't merge them. But the UTR review will look more specifically and in depth at how well the UTR is implemented. The fLEGT action plan review will look at the broader picture and will try to integrate the findings from the UTR review and look more at the interactions of the different components and how the UTR contributes to the broader picture.
Okay.
I hope I have answered.
Yeah. Thank you. So Rachel, do you have anything that you would like to say at this stage?
Soapbox twice in 2 days. But, okay, I'll answer very quickly, I guess. For me, a key point is readdressing the balance in terms of the effort into private sector. It's definitely the weaker partner in this. And I think it's about relationship building. And I think that's something that hasn't been done so much with the private sector. And it's also about the issue for me of selling a business case. I always go to the analogy that if somebody comes to my house and tells me it's a disgusting disgrace and tries to sell me a Hoover to clean it up, I'm not going to buy it. So it's how the message is sold, I think, is key for the private sector as well. So that would be my message. But if they feel loved and they have a business case, I think they would implement a lot more and be more engaged.
Okay, thank you. We can take 2 very quick questions before we break for coffee. I did see some other hands. We have 3 hands. We'll go for 3 quick questions. So firstly, the lady at the front here.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah?
Yes.
Xue Wen from IIED, previously with C4 Cameroon. I'd like to ask a quick question on the informal sector, especially to your name.
Bernard.
Yeah, Bernard. So what do you see the impact of informal sector, the importance and the size of informal sector chainsaw miller activities in planning FLEGT forward, especially given recent C4 reports about how informal sectors in the Congo Basin may be as large as the formal sector. So on that end, Sue, perhaps you could mention quickly on the political economy aspect of FLEGT process in light of informal sector, whether you have any thoughts on how this process could be captured by, say, local elites or the political economy process within the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The question here at the front.
John Buckles, question for Bernard. I might have missed this, but I was wondering whether the review will be looking at the impact of FLEGT on deforestation.
Okay, thank you. And the third question, the hand in the middle, yes, there.
Hugo Charlton, criminal barrister, 1 Grazing Square. It's as the whole thing depends on the enforcement depends on the efficiency of the competent authorities who review the operators and traders' due diligence processes. And bearing in mind that at the minute, as I understand it, general public do not have access to this, is there any way of enforcing and considering whether the competent authorities of the European government, some of whom I consider not very competent, are exceedingly corrupt, is there any way either of making those processes more open for ordinary NGOs to access, or is the Commission itself or other European authorities going to in some way enforce competence in the competence and lack of corruption in the so-called competent authorities? Is that being considered? Because otherwise the whole thing collapses.
Thank you. Perhaps if I could start with Sue, and then I'll give the final word to Bernard. So Sue, there's a question about political economy and informal sector.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that thinking about the political economy is important whether you're looking at the formal sector or the informal sector. I suppose that, and I think that some of the same sort of issues and questions arise. I can see that it's perhaps particularly important in relation to the informal sector because it might make you pick up on relationships and informal arrangements and cultural and social and other factors that you would otherwise be overlooking. But yes, I mean, political economy important, whether you're looking at formal institutions and formal sector relationships or informal sector.
Thanks. So, Indra, any final comments? No?
Nothing.
Okay. Bernard.
On the informal sector, I think there will be other sessions touching.
Yes, tomorrow we'll be talking more about
this topic, but that's definitely something we want to consider in the review. So I talked about impacts, both intended and unintended. I think we need to look at the impacts of the FLEGT action plan and the VPAs on the informal sector, the community forest enterprises, the micro, small and medium enterprises in these countries. That's something we have worked on with your former institution, with C4, and that's something we are trying to address. So that will be part of the review. Impacts of FLEGT on deforestation, that's an important question. At the same time, well, I think everybody in this room will agree that 5 or 6 years of implementation of action, it is probably extremely ambitious and unrealistic to assess a direct impact of what we have done on deforestation figures. I think qualitatively we can and we hope the review can look at how FLEGT is contributing to create conditions that will allow us to better address deforestation. But that's a question that is still open for us. We are very much willing to look at the broader impact of the FLEGT action plan implementation on illegal logging and on deforestation, but we are also very aware that these are huge undertakings and these are not easy tasks. So we are very much willing to partner with others as well on doing that. We know that Chatham House has a methodology and has worked a lot on trying to assess impacts on illegal logging. That's something we want to explore, how best we can cover this. At the same time, our resources are not unlimited. The review exercise will have to focus. If we were to try to have an in-depth impact assessment on deforestation, I think it would take us also a lot of resources. Competent authorities. Well, we see I'm not very much mandated to respond to that. I think it's also the subject of another session. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions to others, but I think there will be elements of answer in the coming sessions on this. But we know that member states are working hard to put in place all the necessary measures in order to enforce the UTR. We know as well that much more can be done. And we see a lot of interesting kind of peer pressure between member states. We convene member states repeatedly and regularly to ask them where they are. And I can tell you that the member states that are advanced are also putting some kind of pressure on other member states, because everybody is aware indeed that we need to keep a level playing field by uniform implementation of the UTR. And the Commission is trying its best to promote that.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. And we are having a couple of sessions focusing on EUTR enforcement tomorrow. So coffee is now served upstairs. I'd just like to say a final thank you to all our speakers. Thank you.